that. This morning, as we approach a message, I want you to get, your Bibles open to several different locations this morning, and I promise you we're going to get there, and we're going to look at a few things together this morning, but I want you to go to Acts chapter 9 and verse 8, and if you got your iPhones out and ready to go to your Bible app or whatever, maybe it's easier for you to write these down so you don't miss where you're at. But Acts 9 verse 8, we're also going to go to Luke chapter 24 and verse 31, and then finally Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7. And I'm going to get rid of my gum here so I don't put Kyle's eye out a little bit later. You say, what in the world? We're beginning in Acts, and I see, Acts going to, the book of Luke. That somewhat makes sense, but then we're going to Genesis? Yeah, that's what we're doing today. We've been looking at a subject matter we did last week and kind of going back close to it this week, but a different direction. One hot mess is what we looked at last week, if you remember, and it just talks about how life is a mess sometimes. Today, I want to preach on the subject, lost in the mess. The mess of life sometimes causes us to miss the most obvious things that are in front of us. Let me give you an example of this, and I think we'll have some fun with this one. How many of you you've lost your glasses? Huh? Maybe it's your prescription glasses. Maybe it's your sunglasses, and you're looking all over the place for them, especially if they're maybe your readers. Yeah. And you're looking all over the place for them, and you even ask maybe your spouse, I can't find my glasses, and then all of a sudden they're involved, and you're looking all over the house, you're checking all those right places, next to the chair, the lazy boy chair, right? You could find them there, you could find them on your nightstand, maybe on the corner of your sink, wherever your go-to places are, but finally you're like, my goodness, and you stop and I can't find them, and then you touch the top of your head. Oh, they're right here, right? And they've been on the top of your head all along. Or not just our glasses, but how about our car keys? We get in a habit of putting them in maybe a certain pocket. All right, and all of a sudden, we're out and we're working and we're busy, and they don't really, they're getting in the way in this pocket, so you put them in the back pocket, and then you go to get in your car. I've lost the keys. And you go back and you retrace your steps, all the places that you've worked, and you're doing this 1,000 times, right? And then finally you're like, oh my goodness, there they are. And you find them. And they've been, your keys, your glasses, your cell phone, they're not trying to play tricks on you, It's not like your glasses are saying, I'm going to get lost, I'm going to hide in my pocket, and then I'm going to go back here, and then I'm going to go back here, and your glasses, your keys, they're not playing tricks on you. It's called lost in the mess. Not only with our glasses, our keys, our cell phone, but our car. I love this one. Aren't parking garages awesome? Until you forget where you parked your car in it, right? I seen a lady the other day. I was at the hospital, and I was in a little bit of a hurry. I get out to the truck, and I'm getting in, and I see her. She's walking away with her little remote. And she's walking around the parking lot, and she's literally pushing the panic button, right? Because she cannot find her car. And I'm like, you know what? One of these times she's going to literally be like 3 feet from her car, and all of a sudden, wah, wah, and going to scare her half to death. Lost in the mess. How about this one? You ever lost a kid? I was waiting on Miss Dawn to speak up there. I even have it. You made my notes, Dawn, just so you know. But you ever lost a kid and they're right in front of you? You said, Pastor, why? Watch this. It's not that these things are trying to play tricks on you, but they're hidden in plain sight. And we get so lost and caught up and focused on things, other things, that we really miss what's right in front of us. And this happens in our personal lives. This happens in our family life. This even happens in the church life. I don't know how many of you noticed, but somebody tell me how many days are in a year? 365. Divide that by 2, and what do you end up with? I'll help you. 182 and a half days. All right? Just so you all know, in 2019, on July the 2nd, we will be halfway through this year. Okay? Now, I don't know what that means to you. I don't know if that surprises you, if you're shocked by that, or if you're like, whew, get this one out of the way. But I'm wondering if we, throughout 2019 so far, we've got lost in the mess of life. You see, first point, we must be careful not to miss what God is doing right in front of us. What I mean by that is, Mom and Dad, don't miss the years. I didn't mean to come your way. Wasn't even thinking, right? Her youngest is now married and another season of their life. And sometimes we get so busy when they're young or frustrated when they're young. Somebody say amen right there. That we really get lost in the mess, don't we? You know that song, Don't Blink? Because just like that, guess what? They're grown. It happens in our family. It happens in our careers. It also happens in church. And sometimes the things that God is doing, obviously, right in front of us, we miss them. Let me give you an example of that. Let me just paint a simple picture for you here at Lighthouse. What God has been doing right in front of us so far this year. Now, I don't know how important it is to you all, but it is extremely important to this guy. Whether or not God gives us a message for Sunday. Now, see, you all don't have that pressure. I mean, you get to come and sit in a comfortable seat, and I'm not, that's awesome. I'm glad that you're here. But some weeks, it is pressure. Trying to figure out what God has for us. Can I tell you how thankful I am for 2019? So far, we are almost approaching 182 and a half days in. And guess what? God has been faithful once again to us. He just keeps speaking into our lives. Let's take a trip real quick to the very beginning of the year. Don't waste your season of life. Do you remember that sermon? And how God showed up. And then not only that week, but generational tug of war where we looked out across the front of our sanctuary. And watch this. We had represented every generation. That's a big deal. And God spoke to us on that morning. The Armor of God series. And God just kept being faithful and faithful. He kept answering prayers. He kept giving us words. He kept speaking into our lives through His Word. Around Easter this year, He gave us Passion Week, which I loved. Lighthouse Passion Week this last year. He gave us, the Passion service, the Good Friday at the foot of the cross. And then that evening He met with us in a Passion service, first one ever. Guess what? Jesus showed up. On that next Sunday morning, death is swallowed up in victory. A fresh look at how we have life through Jesus Christ and His resurrection. But it didn't stop there, and I'm thankful for that. No Perfect People, The Heavenly Porter, Howl Fir Tree, Keep On Singing, One Hot Mess. I'm wondering if we recognize, if we're able to see what God is doing right in front of us. But it didn't just stop with messages. It went on with the worship and what's going on there and how that is amplified and touching and reaching lives. And we are now involved in a time of worship. And not only worship, but the ministries of Lighthouse. Can I ask you a question? Have we really noticed what God is doing right in front of us? Do we see it? Are we able to see it? Because we must be careful not to miss what God is doing right in front of us. But not just that. Point 2. Some reasons why we miss it. You might be sitting there this morning and you might be, maybe not physically folding your arms, but inside yourself you're folding your arms right now and say, well, I don't know how he got all that. I didn't get any of that. And what happens is, I want to show us some things. I think there are some, we are not the only ones that go through seasons of that. But there are some legitimate reasons why we miss it. There are some real reasons why you can't find your glasses even when they're on top of your head. I better put them back on, I can't see. Look with me in Acts chapter 9 and verse 8. Powerful example of this. Acts chapter 9 and verse 8, of course, is the story of Saul's conversion. Saul became Paul, if you remember. He had an encounter. Now, before we share what I've got written down, let me just say this about Paul. Paul wanted nothing more before his conversion than to extinguish the Christian church. What Jesus had set in motion, Paul had devised a plan to smash it. And he done everything he could to do just that. But God had something else in store for Paul. Question: what was it that finally allowed Saul, to see? What did it take? What interrupted his life in that moment? Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, the one that hung on a cross, that went to a tomb and was dead, and on the third morning, just like he said, he did get up. He's now in heaven. He's looking down on Saul Paul. And he says, I'll change him. What did he do? Watch this, he appeared to him. Met him face to face, didn't run from him, wasn't a bit scared of him. And watch, I love it. I mean, you got to read back in this passage. In that moment, watch this. Verse 4. And he fell to the earth. I mean, he sees Jesus and he falls. And watch what Jesus says to him. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Now, Paul's already on the ground. Paul is already on the ground. Look what Saul says in verse 5. And he said, who art thou? Then he calls him by his name, Lord. May I suggest, Saul Paul knew who Jesus was even before he asked who he was. Let me say this. When Jesus shows up in front of you, I guarantee you, I promise you, you're going to see him. But notice with me verse 8. And Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man. But they led him by the hand and brought him unto Damascus. His eyes were opened, but yet he could not see. And I'm wondering if that happens to anyone in the house this morning. Our eyes have been open, but we were unable to see. And the question becomes, why? Two things we learn from the story of Paul. First of all, his unbelief. The fact that he would not believe. The fact that, watch this, his religion prevented him from believing. Not only his religion, but what he already knew. What he knew got in the way of what he was able to see. His unbelief, but not only his unbelief, but listen to me, church, and I love you when I say it, his bitterness. You see, he had already crossed over a line of being upset, disgruntled. He had become bitter. Bitter at the fact that Christ had risen, and there were assembled a group of people that were growing and growing and growing. And just like Jesus said to Peter, upon this rock, not the rock of Peter, but upon the fact that Jesus Christ got up just like He said He would. He said, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And that was happening. And Paul became bitter. May I suggest to us this morning that we better be careful, because some of the reasons that we miss what is happening, what God is doing, what God is blessing, what God is putting together right in front of us, we are missing it because of unbelief and bitterness. Not just the life of Saul, but let's look at Luke chapter 24 and verse 31. I love this story. Luke 24 and verse 31. This is the story of after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And there are two men walking, and they're on their way, leaving Jerusalem, on their way to a city that is known as Emmaus. Now the question becomes, is what are they leaving? That's very important to this situation. But here they are. Jesus has now died. The rumor is that Jesus is not in the tomb, and here these two leave Jerusalem, the place where all of this activity is happening, all of what God is doing. And watch this. Think about this for just a second. Think about how big the resurrection is today. I mean, it's a big deal in history. You cannot get rid of it. It changed the course of everything in history. And they hear this and they walk away from what God is doing. And they find themselves on their road to Emmaus, and somebody shows up. Somebody meets them along the way. We pick up in Luke chapter 24 and verse 31. It says, "And their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight." Jesus shows up with them, and he's walking with them. He's right next to them. They are able to touch him, and guess what? They don't even recognize he's there. Somebody say, how does that happen? In fact, they didn't even know it until Jesus said plainly to them who he was. And then it was too late because he gone. Think about that for just a second. So the question becomes, is what's going on there? Why? What? Some reasons why we miss it. Discouragement. They had placed their life, their trust, their hope in this Jesus. They were present when they took Jesus and they hung him on a cross. They were there when he died. They were there when they placed his body in a tomb. They saw that horrific moment play out in front of them, and they watched this. They missed the victory of the resurrection that was right in front of them because of discouragement. Why is it that we miss what God is doing right in front of us? I think a lot of times because we, like these two, we become discouraged. And instead of our head being held high in expectation, we got to do it again. Not only discouragement keeps us from seeing what God is doing, but disappointment. Tell me these two aren't disappointed. They are disappointed, and that's the exact reason they left. Not only disappointment, but watch this. Jesus says to them, a lack of faith. Did you not believe? I mean, I told you who I was. I told you what was going to happen. You heard what I said, and you chose to leave anyway. Discouragement, disappointment, lack of faith. Watch this. Most importantly, they left where they knew they should be. They knew they should be in Jerusalem. They knew that's where the epicenter of what Jesus the Christ and God through Jesus, they knew that this is the place, this is the hour, this is the time that it's going to happen. This is the birth of the church. And there they go a-walking. I can't for the life of me wrap my mind around why then would they walk away. Why then would they choose to miss what was unfolding right in front of them? And I think it's very clear: discouragement, disappointment, lack of faith. One more example found in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7. You know the story well. It's of Adam and Eve in the garden. God created all that is. He created Adam first, and then out of Adam He created Eve. And all was well until sin entered in. Notice with me what Genesis 3 and verse 7 says. It says, "And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked." Now help me out, Pastor. Help me understand this. What's happening here? Well, a few hours ago, before they ate of the fruit that they knew they shouldn't eat of, they were naked and they knew it not. They were naked and that was normal. They were naked and everything was great. But then in a moment of temptation, something happened. What happened? Well, how about disobedience? How about jealousy? How about rebellion? How about this one? Discontentment. Now, I want you to think for just a second. Discontentment, what do you mean they wasn't content? They had everything. Do you know they didn't even have to pull weeds in that garden? Somebody say, what? They didn't even have to pull a weed in that garden. Do you realize that when they walked around and they went over to where the grapes were growing, I mean, these were two-handers just to pull one off the vine. Can you imagine? They had everything that they wanted, but when the apple was presented in front of them, they couldn't help themselves. What? Now, don't just sit there so pious and say, well, I wouldn't have done that. Why do we miss what God is doing right in front of us? Because we get lost in the mess. And in this particular illustration, they got lost in disobedience. They got lost in jealousy. They got lost in rebellion and discontentment. And may I submit to us, church, this morning, I think these reasons right here are still alive. And some of the reasons we miss what God is doing right in front of your eyes. And I'm praying that you find your glasses today. I'm praying that you have not lost your keys. I'm praying that we see today that Jesus is not finished. He is not done. And He has been. And He is. And He will continue to do a great work. The question is are you going to see it? Because when you see it, you can even become a part of it. Every head's bowed, every eye's closed, no one's looking on this morning.